Hi, I'm Jennifer McCoy from Georgia State University in Atlanta, and I'm chairing this roundtable on can electoral reform break two-party hegemony in the United States? So we have six excellent participants in this roundtable who will each make opening short remarks. I've asked for about 5 minutes each on their position on this question. And then I will moderate a debate among them and also open it up to the audience for Q&A. So I will start just by introducing the topic with some of my thoughts related to this question. And I think the first question I've asked them to address is, if you agree with the premise of the roundtable, that we should even be trying to break the two-party hegemony, what would be your goal in changing the electoral system? Because there are many different types of goals we could have. My own research focuses on polarization, and so I'm going to comment on how changing the electoral system might help to reduce our pernicious political polarization. And what the reason I focus on this is because the U.S. stands out among Western democracies for its extreme partisan political polarization, us versus them combining ideological and effective polarization at the system level. And the United States is also exceptional among Western democracies in its electoral system, primarily its single-member district vote to the House of Representatives, not to mention the Senate and the Electoral College representing an indirect election of the president. Now, recent research comparing democracies around the world indicates that the polarization and the nature of the electoral system may be related to each other, finding that majoritarian systems like single-member districts or first past the post tend to have higher us versus them polarization than more consensus systems like proportional representation. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the electoral system causes polarization, and certainly the way we vote is not the sole cause. Likewise, changing the electoral system alone will not guarantee a more harmonious state of political affairs. But changing the electoral system is likely to help polarization for several reasons. First, this extreme political polarization I'm talking about divides a society into two political camps around a single dividing line. Now, single-member district electoral systems, majoritarian systems, in shorthand, facilitate us versus them political polarization because it encourages a two-party system. Only one party can win, and third parties become wasted votes or spoilers. So this rigid binary choice of parties makes it much harder to break out of pernicious polarization once it arises, because there is no other choice for voters who fear the other party. Second, in this winner-take-all system, voters who choose a losing party may feel they have no representation at all. When partisan antipathy and distrust is high, these voters may feel increasingly alienated or resentful, and they may cease to participate in politics altogether. Third, single-member districts usually have district lines drawn by parties in the United States, which are gerrymandered to favor whichever party is in power at the time. And this creates safer and safer seats, which also facilitates a lack of accountability that is encouraging or allowing corruption and democratic erosion, which in turn further increases polarization. Fourth, the limited choice presented to voters in this highly polarized two-party system means that many voters are not choosing who they want to represent them, but who they want to block from coming to power because they fear them. That is, they're practicing negative partisanship when voting. And finally, a binary party system allows an extreme faction to capture one or both of the major parties, which contributes to polarization, perceptions of mutual threat, and support for democracy erosion. So a different electoral system could help to address these problems in many ways. And I think that we, in fact, should be considering this. And I won't go into detail about how it would help or what more we can do, because I want to turn to the other presenters to hear their ideas and to have a debate about what might be the best in theoretical terms, as well as the most feasible when we're talking about electoral reform. I'm going to start inviting the panelists in the order listed, which I believe is by basically alphabetical order. And so first up will be Scott Mainwaring from University of Notre Dame.
Wow, it's rare that I'm the first in alphabetical order.
Isn't it? Yeah, halfway through the alphabet.
Can you guys see my PowerPoint now?
We can.
Yes.
You can. Perfect. Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. And I have my comments converge a lot with what Jennifer has already said. So the title of the panel is this simple question: can electoral reform break the two-party hegemony in America? And I think the answer to that is very simple. The answer is yes, provided that some reforms be feasible, right? Let me see, I want to put this into slideshow. Is this, I'm sorry, are you, is it in slideshow?
No, you're not showing the slideshow.
It's not, but you could try, yeah, down at the bottom, that one, yeah.
Perfect, yep. So yeah, I mean, the answer I think is simple, that, and it's yes, right? If the U.S., if these three reforms were, if PR for the House were feasible, I have almost no doubt that over a short period of time, at least in the House, we would move to a multi-party system. You know, and that's especially true in the context of a high level of polarization. So the rest of my presentation will ask two questions. The second one is the one that Jennifer said, prepare, this is coming. I could hold that off until later, but maybe I'll just do it now. And the first one is, would a shift to PR be politically desirable? I agree with Jennifer, and for pretty much the same reasons she's already articulated. So I could just leave it here, but I guess I won't. So in this Democracy Journal and another paper, I've worked with Lee Drutman on these topics, and he's been just great to work with. So why do I think, or we think, that it is politically desirable to have PR for the House? First, Jennifer touched on this, but you know, it would greatly reduce or eliminate gerrymandering. If states were the districts, right, it would completely eliminate gerrymandering. And even if a state such as California, which I think has maybe 52 or 53 members of the House, you know, even if it were carved into 5 or 6 districts, the possibilities for gerrymandering would decline precipitously. As Jennifer mentioned, I mean, the reality today is that gerrymandering creates a huge number of safe seats. According to the Cook political report, I looked at it this week, I think it was, you know, for 2024, they can already project, knowing who will win 361 of the 435 seats. And another 30 don't appear to be competitive, but might turn out to be. So that means, you know, roughly 90% of the seats, almost exactly 90%, are safe seats. It's crazy, right? And as Jennifer mentioned, safe seats reduce electoral accountability. They can invite political disaffection. Today, there's so much political passion and polarization that I'm less worried about disaffection and other problems. But they certainly drive polarization, or almost certainly drive polarization, because the main threat to an incumbent is often within the party. And this incentivizes taking extremist positions to avoid being primaried. So a second thing, which Jennifer which she didn't mention. I think she would probably agree with this, and I'm not criticizing when I say she didn't mention it, but with so many safe seats, right? Most people's vote for the House is not consequential. With PR, we would move to a system in which all votes for the House are potentially consequential. The third point, and possibly probably the most important, I think a lot of people believe, and I agree with this, that the great challenge to democracy, U.S. democracy has several great challenges. One is inequality, money in elections, but certainly one of the great challenges is the high level of affective polarization. And shifting coalitions, which would they would certainly be incentivized by a shift to PR, are likely to drive some impulse toward centrist politicians, right? This point is obvious today that, the US politics is very dominated by us versus them politics. With PR, almost certainly more candidates could win by appealing to the center. With more parties, which almost certainly would arise, governing coalitions would usually need to include the center. I'm not suggesting, right, that the center would necessarily be huge, but it would be more at play, that the role of the center would be pivotal. Another point is diversity of representation. We could say a lot about this, but more options would be available to voters. And we know there's unassailable evidence that in PR systems, for example, women get elected more frequently. So I think this would be another highly desirable outcome of a shift to PR. On this second question, is this change politically feasible? Right, I'm sure there'll be a lot of debate in this panel about this, but I think the answer is yes. I don't think it's easy. I don't want to suggest that it's easy, but here are some reasons to believe that it's feasible. It's not some Pollyannish dream. First of all, unlike, for example, direct popular vote for the president, which I think would be a hugely desirable reform, right? PR doesn't obviously advantage one party over the other at the national level. Seats at the national level in the last few elections have been quite proportional to votes. I think it's clear to all of us that, reforms that obviously advantage one party over the other are extremely unlikely, bordering on impossible. Another point on this topic is that unlike, for example, a shift to the direct popular vote for president, a shift to PR for the House would not require a constitutional amendment. So what about the individual level logic? Obviously, it's individual members that would have to vote for this, when what I've just spoken about is party logic. So a lot of members of Congress are frustrated with the dysfunctionality of the current system, so they might be willing to consider a shift. A lot of members every decade are in the position in which they might get redistricted or gerrymandered. That's a substantial downside to current members of Congress. And finally, many members of Congress, especially probably progressive Democrats and the relatively small group of non-MAGA Republicans, would probably find more natural fits in more programmatically cohesive parties. So in sum, I don't think this is some odd pipe dream that it's just a ludicrous outside possibility. I don't think that for a moment. So PR, I want to conclude with this slide. I don't think that PR for the House is the most important conceivable reform, but it is, I think, a politically feasible reform whose merits greatly outweigh the downsides. Moreover, I think if there were a shift to PR for the House, this could start to shake things up in, for example, how the Senate also functions. So that's what I have to say for starters. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Scott. We will move, and good timing. We'll move right on to Pippa Norris from Harvard University. Do you have slides to share, Pippa? And don't forget to unmute.
Unmute and share and hopefully we can all do my slideshow.
Yes, we see.
Perfect.
Well, we see the whole slideshow, so you might want to do.
I know, I'm going to try and get my slideshow into slideshow mode, which is, there we go, slideshow, play from start, and use slideshow. So this is a big question, and obviously I'm going to take it from a comparative perspective, because that's how I love to take these issues. And I wrote years ago a book called Electoral Engineering. Everybody thinks it was called electrical engineering, but anyway, it's electoral engineering, which looked at some of these issues. And I think some of the lessons basically hold. And so let's follow on from Scott in particular. Would reform of the House electoral system in particular reduce polarization, misspelt? And I would personally love to see a mixed member proportional system in which we kept the current seats, but we actually added additional seats. I think that would be the most practical way to do this, in the sense that many other systems have expanded their legislature. The US, in fact, has a very high district magnitude, and so it would make a lot of sense. It would have all sorts of advantages for representation. And the consequences are pretty well known mechanically. In other words, depending on the exact design, how many seats were proportional, how many were continuing on single member plurality, greater party choice is always very likely, because more parties can stand, more party competition in the House, and party representation. More inclusive, as Scott mentioned, in terms of gender. Race is depending very much on a variety of other factors, and it may not have the same consequences. Depends on geography as much as anything else. Higher turnout, yes, we know that in PR you normally get twice the turnout. Less gerrymandering, yes. And all of these things we can look at, because so many countries have adopted mixed member. In addition, if you look at the changes which have been passed in many countries, mixed member has been the one which has happened in about 30 countries in the last couple of decades, as new democracies didn't really want to go completely to PR, didn't really want to go completely to single member. So this is the system. Problem is that, of course, classically, it may lead to greater party polarization, divided societies. One can only think of Israel right now, not less, because, of course, smaller parties can be the kingmakers. Scott said it's the moderate parties. Well, maybe, maybe not, depending on the nature of the cleavages in that society. So one could easily see that there could be all sorts of extreme right parties who manage to do very well in this, in particular districts or particular states, and they can, in fact, end up with the kingmakers. It's often very difficult to predict. We know that. We've got a kind of veil of ignorance about what the practical consequences will be. And always lawmakers predict certain assumptions, and then it turns into something else. And you can think of New Zealand as a classic case in 1993, when they went for a kind of moderate system, and they ended up with a much more fragmented system and with a strong role for the radical right. Leiphart, on the one hand, in our theory, said, of course, power sharing leads towards moderation, because elites, who the party leaders, get a stake in the system, they're not excluded. And Lintz, misspelt, says it's the most dangerous system, because what you're doing in America is combine presidentialism, unless one changes that in a radical way, which is very difficult to think how that would work in a majoritarian system, with fragmented party systems. And that gives you two sets of incentives, two sets of legitimacy, and very little ways in which the president is going to be able to work with the with Congress. Now, all of that being said, what I'd like to emphasize also is that I'd like us to think outside the box. And when I'm thinking of electoral reform, I always think of it from the international community. And we don't think about it as starting with the electoral system, because that's such a high target. Instead, what we always think of is all the other stages. And the emphasis of the UN, and I talk about this mainly because I was working practically on this area at the UN when I headed up for a short period democratic governance. And so we had people who went off to all different countries, and you visited them, and we said, okay, what can we help you with? And it's a menu. And in some ways, it's the politically easiest way to introduce reforms. And the great thing about this is that because some of them are seen as minor and technical, they can still have a big impact on things like party competition, but they're not explicitly directed towards that. And the important point here is that any break or in any stage can have problems for the overall electoral integrity and all the other things that we care about in democratic backsliding. Just to give you a very quick snapshot, and I promise there aren't a million slides, there's just a couple. As you know, the EIP project, which I helped found in 2012, well before any Americans were interested in this, we've now had 10 years worth of data. We ask our experts, like VDEM does, to do a survey, and we ask them a month after each national election. It's a rolling survey, 4,500 experts now, 480 elections, and it accumulates. And the latest one is version 9, just come out, available through Dataverse, and we have subnational surveys as well, for example, in India, in Brazil, and in the United States. So we can drill down. What we do is we ask a series, 49 questions in general, a series of different items. That sounded like me echoing myself, but anyway. When we look at this results, evidence-based policymaking says, how does the US perform? And this gives you a snapshot of the performance of US elections worldwide when you summarize all of these items into a 100-point scale. And what you can immediately see is worldwide, it's pretty moderate. The US is not doing well, especially compared with many other countries where the US would hope it was the leading beacon of democracy, whether we're talking about cases like India or parts of Latin America, or even parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which are much newer, obviously, or Mongolia. So the US elections aren't good in global comparisons necessarily. And particularly if you look at OECD, they're pretty bad. And we have to look at the countries, of course, which are rated highly by these indicators. And you get the Canadas of the world, the Swedens, the Denmarks, that's pretty predictable. But you also get a number of other new democracies, which, according to the experts, when you summarize across the performance, are still doing much better than the US. A Lithuania, for example, a Slovakia, Republic of Korea, the Czech Republic, according to the evidence that we have, scores higher, and this is a 100-point scale. And if we look at, again, thinking about this and broadening the agenda to all the challenges which are there for the US, this is our scores when we summarize 10 years worth of data, evaluations by the expert across each of the dimensions in EIP. And what does it tell us? That some of the basic problems are indeed gerrymandering, as Scott mentioned. Experts feel that that's a particular weakness, and also voter registration and campaign finance and electoral laws. But some of the other things which are there are actually doing quite well, including party registration, media coverage, vote count, etc., etc. So what's the final way of summarizing all of this? Yes, we need to think about electoral reform as a system, but actually there are many other things can be done. And we need to identify a much wider range of potential reforms. And above all, we need to focus not necessarily directly on solutions, but above all on defining the problems more clearly, so that we can understand that there are a range of goals, and different NGOs, different parties, different actors, different areas are going to have different priorities. So maybe it is indeed polarization, but you can't focus in electoral reform on one issue, because maybe the problem is security, and basically how far we actually have effective or efficient forms of administration. Maybe the problems are things of electoral integrity and the inclusion of minorities. The proportion of women, for example, is really pretty bad in America if one looks at it globally. The cost of elections, etc., etc. And I would certainly emphasize things like the professionalization of electoral administration is really high on my list. And it's something which could be done. Technically, we know how to do that if we could have a coalition around those issues. And maybe some of these other reforms could actually address party competition as well, and will have a consequence for that. We need to learn from other countries of things that work. And the more that we can do incremental steps building up, the more minor reforms, I think, can be easier politically than the big ones, but they can be really influential and can be really important for American democracy and preventing backsliding. So that's my kind of pennyworth, drawing on EIP. I hope that that helps address some of those issues, and I look forward to learning how others think about these issues as well.
Wonderful. But yes, thank you. And I want to thank you too for the EIP, which is a wonderful data source. So that's wonderful that you've created that. Okay, now I'm going to move to Jack Santucci, who can introduce his new institution, because I don't have the name, if you would like. Okay, Jack, go ahead.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm starting at Queens College, which is one of the CUNY schools. I just started last week. So I have a couple of slides. My answer to the overarching question is yes, temporarily, and in select places can electoral reform break the two-party hegemony in the United States. Another way to put that is that I think this electoral reform stuff is going to happen anyway at the state and local level, whether that's due to continued agitation by reformers or sort of bigger, weird structural things happening in certain parts of the country, like oversized Democratic parties that are struggling to manage internal cleavages on issues like housing policy or what to do with migrants or whatever. And therefore, we should try to get it right, because we did what we're doing now before in American history. So these are some data from Pew Research as of June 2021 that show the incidence of what the popular imagination, I think, calls an alternative electoral system. Where we've got cumulative voting, limited voting, top X systems, RCV, single transferable vote systems. And what all of these kind of have in common is that they're compatible with nonpartisan elections, which are really popular at the local level, increasingly at the state level, and historically have been popular with people who have, let's say, have plans for a city, maybe where the highways are going to go and what kind of housing is going to be offered. And I say get it right this next time around. This is from an article that came out yesterday or the day before. It is a pretty angry reaction to the piece that Matt Shugart, Mike Latter, and I wrote for the APSA report on political parties, where we basically said, hey, our research question there was, if we were to do PR federally, what would that look like? And we concluded, well, it would probably look like an open list system. And you probably would want to combine that with something that gives you fusion politics to deal with the single seat offices like president and senator. And this piece takes us to task for saying, we should promote party list systems because we as reformers cannot sell a party list system, we think, in a referendum or an initiative campaign. And they say, well, you're just good. We can't pass the stuff, and even if we could pass the stuff, it would get repealed. Well, let's do single transferable vote instead. I think we can look at American history with the single transferable vote, right? And here it is. It was all over the place, not all over the place, right? It was in certain regions that were experiencing certain things at certain times in American politics, like the disruptions to the Republican Party of the progressive era, which is why we get a bunch of STV adoptions in the Midwest. And then, as we start to move into the New Deal, we start to see Democratic parties fracturing in places. But the key thing to note here is that all of these STV systems were repealed, except for the one that exists in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they didn't induce multi-party politics. The theory here, the theory of reform today is let's promote this stuff at a state and local level to have demonstration cases that lead to a national level adoption. That was the theory here as well. And when it was asked, hey, what are you guys going to present? Can you give us a line? I said, well, I want to talk about how holding together majority coalitions is more important maybe than increasing the number of parties or just grasping at any type of PR that we can get. And this is sort of the performance of the single transferable vote in American cities. So eventually, can this stuff break the two-party hegemony? Well, does this break the two-party hegemony? What you've got here are nine city council candidates and some number of candidates to a school committee. And this comes out of a newspaper, and the purpose of this advertisement is for voters to tear it out and bring it to the polls with them on election day. And this advertisement is concealing the major party partisanship of each members of the slate. And if I sat here long enough with you, I could tell you, where the Democrats were and where the Republicans were. And basically this thing called the Citizens Planning Association that exists to contest an STV election subsumes Worcester, Massachusetts Republican Party and the kind of white collar faction of the Democratic Party. That system comes online in 1949 and is repealed in 1960. And what I'm showing you here are the percentage of observed single transferable vote ballot transfers, where the first choice is cast for, well, in this case, the first choice is cast for a member of that slate I just showed you. But through the transfer process, that ballot ends up electing someone from the other side of politics, whether the other side of politics has multiple parties or just one party. And that leakage rate, right, the incidence of that surges such that by 1959, we've got a repeal attempt. I'll spare you the details of why that one doesn't win, but by 1960, both sides of politics, the machine Democrats and the institutional Republican Party, can agree to get rid of this single transferable vote system. And that, I argue, I think I showed in the book that this pattern of transfer leakage had consequences for the operation of city council, right? And this is the majority coalition not able to hold itself together. Those of you familiar with the Congress literature might have heard of a roll rate. A majority is said to be rolled on a piece of legislation when a majority of that majority supports the bill, but some of its own people have defected to the other side, right? And that roll rate surges at the same time that the transfer leaking is surging, and this is what gives you repeal, because the majority coalition can't hold itself together. And I think, for that reason, I've sort of been arguing that we should revisit party list systems, and I'm one of the people in that Democracy Journal symposium, and I make that case there. And we may hear other things about the voting rights implications of complicated ballots, coming back to the idea of getting it right if it's going to happen anyway. And I'll leave it there. I did not practice for that.
All right, thank you, Jack. Next will be Scott Schroefnagel from Northern Illinois.
Thank you, Jennifer. I had sort of thought I would put third-party research in behind me, and I wasn't, because I was so frustrated by what I was imagining is the not very feasible opportunity to reform elections in this country. Although I never imagined that we'd ever legalize marijuana either in some states. So, I guess there is possibilities. And of course, most of the panelists know that, single member districts plurality rule have taken a hit in most every country in the world outside of the U.S. So that, other countries have been looking to reform this. I'm particularly, I have a little more faith that we might be able to adopt multi-member districts than a list system. The multi-member districts are not as foreign, to Americans, maybe. I mean, the state of Illinois, where I am right now, we had multi-member districts for state legislatures as recent as 1980. And of course, we still have multi-member districts for local offices. And so it's not, not the only state. But, what's interesting, if you go back to the Constitutional Convention, 1789, George Washington doesn't speak up much, except for the one issue of the size of the House of Representatives, or how many constituents there should be per member. And on the table was, one member for every 35,000. Of course, counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, and Washington advocated for one for every 30,000, and they ended up with a bit of a compromise. And the original House was 65, and then it grows right until 1911, where it was frozen, and has stayed at 435 ever since. Of course, the country's population hasn't stopped growing since early 20th century. And now we have one member for over 700,000. Only India has, more constituents per representative than the U.S. And our close ally in the UK, over 600 members and about a sixth of the population. of the U.S. So I had a grad student approach me not too long ago, around the same time, well, just prior to Bernard asking me to join this panel, and was interested in third-party stuff. And I told her, I said, well, I don't know where to start, but why don't you see where third parties have had some success in the US? You know, I mean, there's still, it turns out there's about 300 libertarians in the US serving in elected office. But they're all really minor offices, right? No state legislators, of course. And the Green Party, you know, has a, and so then, well, where is this taking place? Well, you know, the Libertarian Party does really well in local offices in Pennsylvania, and the Green Party does really well in local offices in Wisconsin. Some of you might know of my work on the cost of voting, or the COVI, the cost of voting index. I was kind of hoping that, you know, that the COVI would be related to this, but I haven't been able to uncover that, at least in a bivariate sort of way. But so when we looked at Pennsylvania, it turns out the Libertarian party is very well organized in the state relative to other states, and the same with the Green Party in Wisconsin, and in particular with their social media presence and so forth. So anyway, that caused us to try to develop, you know, an indicator of third-party organizational strength, and that's in the works. But just sort of muddling along, you know, we also stumbled on the fact that, you know, I mean, some of you know there's been independents elected from Maine and Alaska and to the U.S. Senate, and we've had governors from, and these are all less populated states, in effect, states where there is, you know, smaller constituencies, you know, and then when we looked at the local level, you know, there's great variety in the constituency size in local councils. Unfortunately, a lot of them are nonpartisan. But when we do find some partisan, we do find a relationship between constituency size and third-party success. And so that's all just sort of a very preliminary take on where we are with that research. You know, I mean, Madison, Wisconsin, you know, Dane County does well. The Green Party does well there. And there's these little pockets. You know, I don't imagine enough that is going to make a big difference. But I mean, in my 2011 book, Third Party Blues, in the final chapter, you know, he's sort of given liberty to kind of speculate what could break the two-party duopoly, and I was imagining doubling the size of the House and creating 2-member districts, and I think that is a reform that you know. And then, I mean, let me just lastly say that I am an advocate for third parties, and in particular, I've been able to show in research from now a couple decades ago, but that, you know, the populists and the progressives, they both were able to attenuate polarization in ways that created compromise and produced a lot of progressive reforms. You know, a lot of there were populists in the U.S. House who ran as fusion candidates with a Democrat. Other populists ran as a fusion candidate with a Republican. So these people were in a particularly good spot to broker compromise, the Populist Party members. By the way, the other sort of explanation for some minimal third-party success has been fusion. You know, it's still allowed in 5 states, not sort of of course, not in Minnesota, where Rehnquist said that third-party involvement is a problem for competition or something really ridiculous. But New York has the most sort of progressive, or has kept fusion alive as much as any state, and third parties do better in that state. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Bernie Thomas.
Okay, let me share my screen and put the my slides up, and that's
from Valdosta State in Georgia. Forgot to say that.
That's right, from Valdosta State University. Let me do you guys see the slides? Is it showing?
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, let me just try to get this full screen. And I'm very happy that we're doing this panel, that this was about a year in making, and went through a lot of ups and downs trying to get it together right up until the last minute, in my case. But I'm very glad that we're all here. And let me begin by answering. I guess I would give a very similar answer to most of the panelists about where I would see reform, where we would hope it would go, and that I'm a supporter of some form of proportional representation, and that I would agree, and I'm not going to repeat what others had said, but would also agree that the two-party system is problematic and in fact dangerous, among other reasons, because it becomes easier if one of the two major parties becomes authoritarian. It becomes easier for that party to gain power. What I want to do is talk a little bit about ranked choice voting, and that if the two major reforms that are being promoted are some form of proportional representation, and also, on the other hand, ranked choice voting. And the argument for ranked choice voting, and I'm not going to, the ranked choice supporters give many reasons for why they support it. And one of them is the hope that it would increase the number of parties. And my research suggests that would not be a reason for supporting ranked choice voting, that it probably would have no impact on the number of parties. And let me just to set the framework here. Most of us know this, but I'll mention it anyway, that ranked choice voting is basically a type of, or several types of preferential voting. The idea of people ranking candidates and then going through an iteration to determine who winds up winning. And what that's supposed to do is eliminate the need for strategic voting. So the Duverger's law framework, the first premise is that the people don't want to vote for a minor, let's say an unviable candidate, because all it would do is support another candidate if you're talking about a winner-take-all system like the one we have in the US, if a first-past-the-post system. So what they would want instead is a ranking system like Australia has, and this is supposed to eliminate the need for strategic voting. And so what I wanted to do is, as a starting point, and I've only put 3 slides in to try to make this quick and stay within my 5 minutes, is to start by taking a look at Maine voting in the House of Representatives. The Maine was the first state for federal elections to start using ranked choice voting, and it started so in 2008. And if you take a look at the graph, the first thing you can see, and it says rather clearly that there was absolutely no change in the number of third parties, the percent vote for third parties. If strategic voting was pushing it down, or if parties weren't running because of that, then you would expect the Maine vote to increase. Now, there's only been 3 elections. The third parties have not been the strongest in Maine, despite easy ballot access laws. So this can be only as a starting point. Thus far, we're not seeing any change in America. So how do we then look at it another way? And so what I wanted to do is take a look at it then from a comparative perspective. The big case for for the argument that preferential voting would increase the number of parties is Australia. And I've seen more than a few presentations where Australia, presented independently of any other country, was shown as evidence that if we change to preferential voting, the number of third parties would increase. So for our second slide, I'm showing now, this is based on, I'm referring to it as unviable candidate, vote for unviable candidates. What it really is the vote for any candidate within the district that isn't one of the top two. In other words, if the Democrats and the Republicans are the strongest, or in the UK example, Labour and the Conservatives are the two strongest in the district, then anyone who votes for pick any of the other third parties, that would be someone who would wind up in this chart. So it's all taken down to the district level. And if you look at this, here is Australia. Australia in this system is smack in the middle. There is absolutely no difference in the percent of vote for unviable candidates in Australia. In other words, any one of but the two strongest candidates in the district in Australia than the rest of the system. What you have, at least within this setting, are two big outliers. Liberia being one where there is no particular party that's got any major power here, and the other one is the US. Now, it may look like US is the one and only country where two parties completely dominate in first past the post systems. That's probably not true. Jamaica probably could belong here as well, and probably also the Bahamas. But nonetheless, the critical point on this is the center point of Australia, where Australia is showing no difference from any other single member district systems, any of the single member plurality systems. And I just want to show one more, and again, trying to keep it very short and without going into a lot of the detail. I also did this analysis historically. So basically, this is district level data for the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, Canada, and India, all from the point of democratization. In the US, Canada, and UK's case, it's basically starting around the 1870s. And here is what you will see if you look at this. US is in blue and Australia is in green. And what you can see is that over starting around the 1920s, these systems went in two different directions. And all the four others were moved up in a consistent pattern. What we have is globally, at least looking at these larger cases, a steady increase in vote for candidates other than the top two, rising up until, and I stopped the data at the end of the last decade. No difference, basically. If anything, Australia is more like the US than any of the other countries right now. So it certainly doesn't give a lot of credence towards the ranked choice argument. And on the other hand, the United States over here used to be the place where you had the largest amount of vote for third parties. And then there was a collapse starting around 1920, in which case the United States became a place where there is and is now practically no voting for third parties. My belief, without going into the specifics of the theory, is that this has a lot to do with the way that campaigns are funded and how campaigns have changed. This in the US was a period of open participation, and that was the way parties worked. And then you started moving towards a nationalization of parties, and then to mass media controlled by independent organizations, and you have the collapse. And on the other hand, you have the other countries where it's much easier for parties, smaller parties, to get involved. And what we can see is a slow and steady rise of votes for minor parties. So I'm just going to stop here so we can move on to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Bernie. And I lied about alphabetical order. I was going by the APSA list, and I see David Bateman was at the bottom. So sorry, David, you're up now.
No worries. For my sins as being always first, I finally get to go last.
You let Scott be first for once. So,
so can people see my slides? I'm assuming.
Yes, we
Fantastic.
can. Yes.
So I'm sort of the odd one out here in that I don't primarily study sort of electoral systems. I study voting rights, democratic institutions more broadly, and I've been doing a lot of work on democratic backsliding. And so I come to this sort of from that perspective. And so first off, I just think I want to sort of echo everything that Pippa Norris said, that Jennifer McCoy said, that Scott Mainwaring said, that in the long run, I think a multi-party, non-majoritarian system would greatly improve U.S. democracy. I think this has been sort of a common theme. I don't think there's many sort of voices sort of objecting to that. I do think that there are factors besides electoral reform that will make getting to a multi-party system difficult and likely to be slow and patchy. That's fine. Slow and patchy is not too bad. There are worse things. Then that period of sort of transition, however, raises the question in my mind of whether or not the short run costs will be worth it. And the short run costs in my mind effectively come from sort of the danger of democratic backsliding given a radicalized Republican Party. And so I'm in a sort of a weird position where I simultaneously think that a transition to multi-partyism through what I think are in many cases very feasible electoral reforms would help de-radicalize the Republican Party and would considerably strengthen American democracy by reducing pernicious polarization, but that might take a medium-term, long-term sort of time to get there. And the question would be, well, what happens in the short term? And so just sort of going through these points where a multi-party system would be better, this was already discussed in a variety of ways, so I won't sort of dwell on it much. Interaction of social cleavages with majoritarian institutions is an especially problematic arrangement. Proportional representation might reduce political polarization. It's been a major driver of backsliding. It might slightly improve trust in institutions or lead voters to believe their views are represented. I think there's some evidence for all of these things. I think that other people on this panel can speak much more cogently to this and already have. I do want to sort of call into question how quickly electoral reform could get us to a multi-party system. So first off, there's still presidential selection. The runoff established by the Constitution is a hot mess, right? Nobody in their right mind thinks the best thing to do if nobody gets a majority in the electoral college is send it to the previously constituted Congress so that they could vote without any basis of weighted according to their population, but by states. It does favor Republicans, which I'll come back to, but it's not even so much that it favors Republicans so much as it makes it an extraordinarily difficult calculus to work on. You can't build coalitions really around something as complicated as figuring out which seats you will have a majority of the delegation for in previous election. So it's just a hot mess, but getting rid of it is effectively off the table. There's also, and one of the reasons I think this matters is that the electoral college system as it is set up puts a very strong premium on two-partyisms. And so there's a very strong push for two parties. And so that might, you change the House of Representatives, which I think I agree with Scott, that it's totally feasible and totally legal and totally something that you could even build a coalition around. I'm not sure how quickly it will lead to multi-partyism because I think that there's a strong anchoring weight in the presidency, especially given that nationalized politics in the United States means that political choices are being made primarily for voters with the national party system in mind, and especially with the presidency. Sort of good evidence now that most voters are looking to the national system and looking to the presidency. So it's going to be, and that sort of shapes their sort of downstream choice. Yes, there's still ballot splitting. Yes, there's a very popular Republican governor in Vermont, right? So these things can happen. And I expect that as you change the institutions, you will create the space for more parties. But there's a question of how fast. Then there's the cultural legacies of two parties. And I sort of mean culture in the very broad, sort of, it's not the right word for what I mean, but basically, voters and office seekers have deeply grounded partisan identifications. And most office seekers are going to want to stay with a major party until there's evidence that voters will support it. And voters will support it so long as there's not a viable other political party. That's all stuff that institutions sort of change the institution, people start sorting their way out. But again, it points to the sort of drag of the current system. So what? Who cares about the drag? I don't see why that should matter in a healthy democracy where time was not of the essence and where there was not immediate threats. Yeah. So I think that that is not the case that we're in. So in the United States, I might ask, yeah, this is fantastic. In the United States, I think we threatened the immediate threat of a radicalized anti-system party possibly coming to power. I think that it was already radicalized. And so one question that comes out of this is basically whether or not, so the way I've been thinking about this is whether or not proportional representation and some form of electoral system reform could be a form of democracy reinforcing hardball by marginalizing the far right. Over the long term, I think that that's actually very, very likely. And I think that that's one of the many reasons why we should support it. In the short term, it's not as clear. And here's my thinking about it. There's a variety of, given all these other unamendable things, right? The electoral college, the fact of the presidency, the sorting of party constituencies. The question that I want to know, or one of the major questions that I want to know before I'm sort of enthusiastic in the short term about electoral system reform, as enthusiastic as I am about it in the medium to long term, is whether it would have the effect of disaggregating the right and far right more than the left and center left in the short term, such that it would shape the likelihood of who's going to win the presidency. Worst case scenario for short-term electoral reform is that the Republican Party remains relatively radicalized. The radical factions hold it. The advantages of holding together at the presidency outweigh the advantages of sort of splitting into different parties at lower levels. And ultimately, they're able to sort of hold together while Democrats collapse. This is one of the reasons why I think that sort of the no labels third-party run, which I generally love, a good third-party run, is a dangerous innovation at this moment, and a dangerous innovation in that forum, because ultimately it'll have the primary effect of undermining the pro-democracy coalition and empowering an anti-democracy coalition. So I don't have a good answer to this, but the things that I would like to know are, well, in the medium term, in the short term, how does electoral reform, if it's done in sort of the House, where I think it's most feasible, or done in states where it might also be feasible, how do the parties respond to this? Which of them are more fractious? I have no idea, actually, which party is more fractious right now. How quickly would these factions within these parties take advantage of the new rules to form new parties? Which party's current voters would respond quickest to the situation? And in a way, responding quickly here might actually be a problem if it fragments and splinters a pro-democracy coalition. And then there's sort of the question that Pippa raised of whether or not multi-party presidentialism can be even more dangerous than the current situation, which I don't have a great answer to. But I do think that sort of thinking through the problems of the presidency is sort of especially important. And ultimately, I just sort of want to endorse then both sort of thinking about opportunities for proportional representation, think about opportunities for moving to a multi-party system, but also a broader electoral reform agenda of the type that Pippa laid out. What are the various ways in which you can strengthen American institutions, strengthen American elections, not sort of separate from moving to encouraging a multi-party system, but as part of an incremental package to achieve that? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, David. I was very distracted during your presentation trying to control the the intervention. I wanted to ask the participants a question now. So what I got from the initial presentations were several people kind of interested in PR, or at least see the benefits of it. A couple of people speaking against some form of ranked choice voting, whether that's single transferable vote or some other form, speaking against it. But Jack and Bernie, I didn't get quite what you were for instead of that. I got your argument against it. David, I'm sorry, as I said, I was distracted. So I earlier got that you think that PR could be good, but it'll be very slow to get there. So I'm not sure how you ended up, if you had a particular thing, but I would kind of like to hear from Jack and Bernie briefly what you might be for, and then from everybody else, PR, I think David presented something well. PR alone is not enough. And I think Pippa pointed out the broad range of things, and others pointed out there's a lot more that matters. So if we can't change the Senate, I think one big question when we're talking about this, if we can't change the Senate or the Electoral College, is it really going to matter to even try and change the House? In my little article coming out in this Democracy Journal, I argue it will help, but not everyone may agree. And then there's the mid-range option that Scott Schwefnagel mentioned, the multi-member districts, and I kind of favor that as maybe a potential mid-range for multi-member districts with RCV, with ranked choice voting, sort of a on the way toward proportional representation, perhaps. So I'm wondering if we could kind of debate these points for a minute, and then I will open it to the other participants. People, and what I'm going to ask anyone to do who wants to speak is to either use the raised hand function. You can also put a question in the chat if you prefer. And I will try to monitor the conversation. But if I could just start with the participants first, kind of responding to these the presenters responding to these initial questions, that would be great. So, Bernie?
Oh, I guess I could go first, and then I was going to let Jack was mentioned first, but okay, I'll just jump in then. I mean, I slid right over it to focus on other parts, but if I was able to pick a system, it would be mixed member proportionality. That would be the one that I think I'm a big fan of New Zealand, at least the way they run their electoral system. There are, I mean, as I've looked closer into it, like any other system, there are concerns I have, especially trying to make that work if you stick it with the House of Representatives to the states controlling the number of seats, because that would mean in small states where they have only one or two representatives, that's practically going to have no impact. In fact, if Wyoming, it stays a single member plurality. That would be a concern. Even for larger states, you'd have to increase the numbers a lot. At least that's what I've had with my math, which is concerned than anything else. So that's where I'm at on this one.
Thanks, Bernie. And I did want to say, and Pippa put this in the chat. Yes, I kind of skipped over mixed member proportionality. I was considering that within the broader range of PR, but a mixed system of some single member districts and some multi-member districts with PR as an alternative. Certainly that was proposed. So now we have two proposals for that. And Jack, what would you prefer?
I think we should adopt the Mehmet system to elect the Congress. No, just kidding. So one thing that happened to me when I studied how electoral reform happened in Western democracies in order to come up with a theory and then use it to explain why it was happening in cities is that I got squeamish. Because you've got to break eggs to make an omelet, and you start to look at the kinds of eggs that got broken in American cities, or you start to like run counterfactual histories of Belgium in the absence of PR adoption, and you're like, oh, I don't know. Pippa asks, why isn't anybody talking about MMP? Nobody's talking about open list PR either, except for me and a couple of other insane academics. We've been described that way. And the conversation is sort of dominated by this ranked choice thing, which isn't even acknowledged as an electoral system in electoral systems textbooks. And it's just sort of this kind of forced down the throat feel that all of it really has right now. And I'm squeamish. At a technical level, the thing that I wrote with Matt and Mike Latner didn't get behind MMP because we thought that it might be seen as unconstitutional, that constructing regional compensation districts, policing dummy lists and stuff like that. We don't have to go into that if it's not helpful.
Great, thank you. And other participants, respond if and I'm going to try to work on this while you guys are talking. Who would like to respond
So,
to questions. Is PR is a single is change? Is it going to be worth it if we don't do more things? And yeah, Pippa, go ahead.
I was going to
sorry.
reinforce Jack's point that ranked choice voting is not a voting system. It depends totally on whether you have single member districts or multi-member districts. It's preferential voting. Let's face it. We know that we have that system. It's on our books because we have a couple of countries which use it and have used it for many, many, many years. And then if it's multi-member districts, then it's proportional. If it's single member districts, it's majoritarian. So I think there's a tremendous confusion in the American debate, and I'm not sure why the whole agenda isn't about a mixed member system, which is much more practical. People know the single member districts. They know Germany. They know how it works. We've got long experience of that. We know that there's about 30 countries that have a variety of mixed member systems. Some of them are proportional. New Zealand went from a two-party system for a whole century until an 8-party system overnight. Similar experiences. So I think even our job as political scientists would be very much just to clarify the options and not to think about the partisan consequences, but to think about a range of consequences in a matrix design where you say which electoral system has which consequences. And that way you kind of stand back and you say, here's some examples, here's some evidence. But again, let's not focus on immediate a solution, because if you do that, it'll go down, it'll just disappear, it won't work. If you think about what we're trying to achieve, and then alternative ways to get it, I think is a much more practical way. That's my pennyworth anyway.
Thank you. And David Bateman.
Yeah, so just two quick thoughts. Is it still worth it? And a plug for MMP. One of the advantages of MMP is that while it has not been used at the congressional level in the United States, there was historically something quite similar to it in the sense that many states would have sort of overlaid large statewide at-large districts, so people would have multiple votes. And so there is a tradition of doing this. Reopening the capacity of states to do that, I think, would be too little, and frankly, it could be a little bit problematic itself. But it does mean that it is sort of, there is a cultural tradition, at least some legal tradition, for something approaching MMP. As for whether it's still worth doing it, even if you can't get rid of the Senate or you can't reform the Senate presidency, I think it's absolutely worth doing. The question is sort of making it part of a broader package and making sure that we think carefully about advantage within the relative parties and how it's going to play out. And you can't make good predictions about that, but I think the most likely thing is that it would lead both parties to sort of persist for a while, and then gradually it would lead to factions to break off. If that's the case, that sounds perfectly attractive.
Let's go ahead to participants. Peter, oh, sorry, I see Scott Mainwaring.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick comments. I agree with David Bateman. I mean, as you saw, I come out squarely in favor of PR and multipartism, but the system of electing the president if there's no majority in the Electoral College totally gives me the willies. It is to me the thing that gives me the most pause about a shift to PR and multipartism. Second, Jack said that he's viewed, I forget what term he used, but as a weirdo for favoring open list PR. I mean, to my mind, I agree with him. That is not to say that he's a weirdo, but rather I think that for American politicians and voters, party lists would be a total non-starter. They are so alien to our traditions. I mean, I think that mixed member proportional is feasible given our traditions, or open list PR is feasible. I think closed list PR is a total non-starter given the mentality of American politicians and voters. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go to some of the participants. Peter Lavinia.
Yeah, Peter Lavinia. I came in a little late. I'm at political scientist SUNY Oneonta, but my other hat, in which I'm interested in all of this, is I'm co-chair of the Green Party here in New York. And so one of the things we've been doing over the last year or two is trying to draft a PR bill for New York State. And we've kind of looked at single transferable vote, MMP. And I guess I'm curious, Because actually, Jack, I agree with you in terms of open lists. I much prefer it as a system, but is it feasible to look to list systems here at the state level or at the national level? It seems, I think, as Scott was saying, that MMP is there's a history of it, and it seems potential that it could be ruled viable in a way that list systems might not be. So I guess I'm just curious if this has already been answered. I'm sorry if I came in a little late, but is there any way that might be feasible to institute a list versus SCV MMP?
Should I answer that now, or do you want to take more questions, Jennifer?
Oh, yeah, that's actually a good idea. Let's see about Ryan Johnson.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the presentation. That was really great. There are two aspects of this discussion that I feel like there should be a distinction between the candidate and party preferences for what's going to happen in terms of political outcomes. So candidates are usually very centered on their district, and parties, especially in the United States with the nationalization and polarization of politics, you know, there can be a big difference between those two. And so in general, this also leads, I think, to this question in American politics, where we are conflating candidate selection with primaries and then what turn into policy outcomes in the general election. So far, I've noticed a lack of discussion about how a lot of this is going to change, and it will, candidate selection, even candidate entry. We already know that there's a disparity between what local political leaders think is an ideal candidate and what ends up being electorally viable. Brockman has some work on this. And I think that also in the theme of this year's APSA theme of misinformation and disinformation, there's a lot of really wild stuff that gets said about ranked choice and other election systems. And I don't really know where it comes from. I see some stuff, for example, on Fair Vote. They're probably the best in terms of having stuff where they will cite political science journals, but a lot of the campaigning that happens for or against these systems are not based on what we would call like positive political theory. So I wanted to, open that up and see if anyone had comments on that, specifically maybe Jack or Scott Schraufnagel or Scott Mainwaring.
Okay, great. I think I don't see other questions unless I'm missing one, but I do want to ask, I see Pippa put in the chat a note that I'm really curious to hear about more because I wasn't aware of this, that the UK went from centuries first past the post to adopting 6 electoral systems used simultaneously for different offices in the 1997 reforms, which I didn't know about that. So I'm very curious about that. But can I ask for volunteers to respond to these 2 questions? David Bateman.
I have thoughts on Pippa's comments, not on the first 2. But I do, other than to agree that, it's going to change candidate entry quite a bit.
Okay. Okay, I'll come back then, David, to that question. Jack.
Yeah, I don't put my hand down. Okay. To Ryan's point about misinformation and the debate in any given place about whether to adopt some reform being beside the point, right? A lot of the talking points on both sides are kind of beside the point. And that definitely comes through in the historical record on this stuff, where you've got one side thinking 10% of votes is going to get you a seat and therefore multiple parties are going to bloom. And the other side is like, voters are just so confused by this. And yet there's like the Chamber of Commerce is fine with STV in local government as long as it's putting that highway right through the middle of Worcester and the vote leakage doesn't become a problem. So, we've been there before. And I think Ryan's point about so much of this really just comes down to the politics of nominations. I think that's an apt point to make. Right. That's really what RCV has single seat RCV has kind of become that. It's become this vehicle for getting rid of party nominations. I come back to sort of Peter's questions. Maybe I didn't write enough down, but MMP at the state level does strike me as a reasonable thing to advocate for, because you don't need to come up with regional compensation mechanisms, you probably need substantial increases to the sizes of state legislatures. And, you know, we should have a conversation with the state politics scholars about that. And maybe some of the pathologies of really large state legislatures under a two-party system would be attenuated with strong multi-party politics under MMP at the state level. And Peter, I confess to forgetting your question about OLPR, but if you want me to talk to the Greens up there in New York State about that versus STV, we can do that.
Yeah, I'll send you an email if that's okay. I'd love to.
Okay, David.
Yeah, so just on Peter's thoughts, and what Jack was saying about sort of the size of state legislatures are, for the most part, with I think the exception of maybe not even California, maybe California, are already much more representative in terms of they're much larger relative to the size of the population already. So there is some sort of flexibility there for something like MMP. I also think that, like, it is, you know, doing these things at the national level is attractive for a variety of reasons. Doing them at the state level is feasible for, like, very easily in some sense, you know, not easy, for a variety of reasons. One of them just being that it's a lot easier to envision a type of comprehensive reform of the constitutional structure of a state in order to sort of make sure that by changing the electoral system and changing the number of parties, you're not creating various other sorts of problems. It's a lot easier to do that at the state level. You can do, like, sort of constitutional amendments usually require sort of bare majorities. You can call constitutional conventions. New York once again decided that we don't want a constitutional convention because everybody believes that they will be screwed over in a constitutional convention. But there is a capacity for greater level state level reform.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been thinking that too. Starting with the states actually makes more sense to me. Okay, Scott Schroefnagel and then Ryan Johnson.
You know, regarding that issue of misinformation and public support for change and so forth, I just recall from some work I did a while back about, you know, question wording really affects support for third parties dramatically, and or electoral reform. That, you know, when you ask people sort of, do you think there ought to be a third option or something like that? Overwhelming support. You know, lots of people think that, but you know, anytime you know, electoral reforms are worded in a way that sound partisan or whatever, in particular in today's climate, you know, the spitefulness of people's political views and so forth, people are opposed to things, you know, not you know, out of ignorance and so forth, and that's an extra hurdle. That's all I have.
Ryan.
Yeah, I wanted to comment more on the like the state level approach, because and this is something that Scott Schroefnagel brought up, that for example, I'm at Washington University in St. Louis, and recreational marijuana was approved and went into effect on February, and that still in my mind seems infeasible for Missouri to have recreational marijuana. So in that sense, in the same way that we see primary election reform in certain states, and we see citizens initiatives for medicinal marijuana or recreational marijuana in states, I think that there's also a conversation about feasibility that might need to focus on, you know, how, if reform is going to happen, how is it going to happen? And if it's like the way that medicinal or recreational marijuana played out, it seems like it's going to be pushed through by more progressive states potentially, but I don't know if that's the case. Those are just the states that are capable of perhaps doing this with constitutional amendment or citizens initiative.
I want Jack. Yes.
Kind of dying to raise a point that, so I, you know, I left a job in Philadelphia, and as I left Philadelphia, they had an old clunky old way to make sure that you had both Republicans and Democrats in city council. And as the proportion of Democrats in the city relative to Republicans declined, Republicans stopped getting those seats, right? And then sort of two solutions to three solutions to that problem were floating around. One solution was just get rid of parties and go to just interest group politics with a nonpartisan RCV system, right? That's the kind of goo-goo approach. Another approach was let's sue to kick the Working Families Party off the ballot, right? So that the Republicans can get the two at-large seats that historically had been reserved to them, right? And then another approach would have been sort of for the Democratic Party to say, have a difficult internal conversation about whether it wants to work with the Working Families Party as a coalition partner. And heck, let's increase the size of city council to make room for both of us. And oh, by the way, we can get Republican buy-in and bring them on board for that reform package too, right? And that conversation's not happening. Nobody's letting that conversation happen. It's final five voting or bust, right? And that just kind of allows us to avoid these deeper issues about choosing reform partners. And we can talk about, where was never Trump on voting rights and this PR stuff, arguably, when the window opened for a couple of years there. All right, I'm babbling. That's enough out of me.
I would like to go back to Pippa's point about the cultural question and how hard it would be to change. And I think that David was going to make a comment, but Pippa, I also wanted to ask you, and if you want to respond to this as well, you made a mention of New Zealand because unintended consequences are a major issue to deal with, and Jack has referred to that in his research, the unintended consequences of the early reformists. But with the New Zealand, Pippa, you mentioned that it had resulted in fragmented parties and a strong radical right party. My impression had been that New Zealanders were fairly happy with the change to PR. So could you update me on that as well? So I'm going to ask Pippa and then David and Bernie too.
There are about 5 countries that all had major reforms, established democracies in the early 1990s, and New Zealand was one which had it accidentally. The Prime Minister, of course, somehow mentioned a promise that he was going to hold a referendum when he actually meant to say he wasn't going to hold a referendum. So then they had a referendum. The first referendum was, should there be reform? Everybody said yes, because they didn't like the two-party system. And then they said, as the second referendum, what system should we adopt? And by the way, that's the way to actually run a referendum if you're going to do it, because you can get a coalition on the first, and then you can have a plurality on the second. And at first they hated it because they found this sudden change overnight. Again, they had a century of two-party politics in New Zealand. It was very nice. It was left, right, left, right. And suddenly, the New Zealand first arrived. But then after a while, it settled down again. And of course, they learned to work with coalition politics. Other countries that also had reform at the time have had other consequences, like Japan, which really changed its system and really hated what happened. They thought they'd get rid of corruption. There was also Italy, which was very unstable because the centre parties were falling apart, the Christian Democrats, and they've had a continuous series, and they've gone back and forth, back and forth. Dick Katz is great on that. And then Britain had big issues about this, which have been debated since the 70s when the party system fragmented. Although two-party system still in government and opposition, there were 13 parties in parliament, and the Lib Dems were the largest party, of course. They moved up in the 80s. They wanted reform. The major parties blocked them. But because Labour was out of power for such a long time under Thatcher, a coalition of the left eventually said yes and adopted this under Blair, that there should be reform in the period running up to the big overwhelming landslide. Blair got in with all of the power he could do, introduced major reform on everything: House of Lords, Assembly for Wales, devolution for Scotland, STV for a peace power sharing in Northern Ireland, elected mayors with AV, PR for the European elections. So they adopted this because they had the majority. They could do this as part of this constitutional reform. And they also, by the way, adopted a written Bill of Rights. They'd never had a constitution before in Britain. It was never written down. Nobody bothered with that. But anyway, they did. And suddenly Britain had all of these electoral systems. The public wasn't actually that interested, and they didn't care that much. You'll find most of the times it's too technical. They don't really know anything about the solutions and how they work, etc. So it was left to the technocrats, all of whom lined up all of the political scientists to give recommendations. And what's worth noting is they adopted different systems for different bodies because they had different functions in a way in what they were trying to achieve. They didn't put all their eggs in one basket. For Europe, for example, they wanted PR because that was the system which was used in Europe. It made it more uniform. For elected mayors, they wanted AV. For Northern Ireland, they wanted STV, etc. So the alphabet soup. And the electorate adopted really fast. They've used all these systems. They don't seem to care which it is. You can have the same elections with 2 different systems on the same day. The electoral management body, the UK Electoral Commission, does it very well. They're very efficient. There's still dissatisfaction, of course, with all sorts of aspects of elections. Most recently, the whole business of electoral registration and electoral ID, just like in the UK, like in the US, and how people have been disenfranchised. But the basic point is this: you can, if you have a technocratic issue, implement it if you have sufficient political weight behind it. But that requires a major party being committed to electoral reform, unless you have a popular referendum by accident, more or less. And of course, America doesn't have national referendums. So that is really why I'm saying try all these other types of reforms. For example, nobody's mentioned changing the party law reforms in America. The ways in which you have to get signatures, which are controlled by the Democrats or Republicans, getting rid of partisanship in electoral officials, which I regard as one of the major scandals in America, needs to be addressed. So the hegemony is not simply through the vote system, it's all the other aspects which are there. I see David's doing his thumbs. Anyway, I'll shut up for a bit.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful, and it sounds actually encouraging to some extent that at least voters can adapt. I'm going to go to David, and then I'm going to give it to Bernie for the last word.
So I just wanted to say, I was going to say something along the lines of culture matters until it doesn't. And when I think about culture in this sense, I really mean sort of a type of stability around expectations where everybody kind of expects a certain type of game to be played, a certain type of rules, and that it all holds together because everybody's sort of expecting it. I do think that the broader culture of election administration in the United States is one that plays an enormous role in sustaining the two-party system. And by culture here, I mean the fact that it's the parties who run it, the fact that it's impossible to get on the ballot line, the fact that, so I in Ithaca, I went to vote. There has to be a Republican and a Democrat there. The guy who was supposed to be the Republican at some point was just like, well, I'm a Democrat. Shit, I shouldn't say that. Like the whole thing is just a monstrosity. But I think that people are socialized into those roles. They learn those roles. They expect those roles. They expect that to play out. And as office seekers are making their choices, the idea of going to a third party is absurd. As you start changing the little bits, you break away the whole thing. So you know, the UK's turn to a variety of different electoral systems, it happened all at once, but it didn't come out of all at once. Like there have been sort of piecemeal, incremental conversations about broader changes for a long time. And so I think that's exactly right.
Okay, great. And Bernie, you can wrap it up. And unmute, please.
I guess I will start by saying that they're just simply agreeing with the points that David had made and Pippa had made. A lot of people had made about this, that the third party literature, you know, historically has had a long stretch of making claims about reasons why third parties don't work in America and effectively how easy it would be to change. Ballot access laws are supposed to have stopped third parties. Well, evidence from me and from Scott Schaffragel demonstrate pretty clearly, and others demonstrate pretty clearly, that hasn't been a major factor. You know, my research has shown that the idea of fusion has changing the fusion actually would probably have practically no impact. There's a lot of other research out there. There's been a lot of change in the way we see this. So part of it is, the first one is that I think one of the critical points to come out is this emphasis about, and I really like David's point about this, about that change can come, but change will be slow if it comes, right? This is not something that can produce rapid change. But I also think that this is a positive sign. And what really got, when me and Jack started first talking about this, really got us to be wanting to put together this panel, because of changes in the way that the research in this area is going. Those of us who are doing the work now have, and I'm going to include me and Scott and Jack and this, the Americanists, more of a historical perspective, more of a comparative perspective. I mean, Jack and I both have spent a lot of time studying electoral systems out of the US. We're not simply the straight Americanists. You'll notice half this panel are comparativists, or more are comparativists. And I think that this is where a lot of the important change is coming, that at least the research is becoming, I would say, much better and much more serious. And so it's a great thrill that we were able to, under all the circumstances we faced, put this together, because I think we've discussed some rather important issues if we're going to talk about electoral reform in the United States in a more serious level than I think has been done in the past. So, and I want to thank you, Jennifer, for grabbing the helm and taking this to the last muddy waters of putting this together.
Thank you. And I'm going to be re-listening to the recording since I really missed a lot of it. In fact, I'm going to stop the recording right now. So